and I'm going to be discussing the readings on 21st century urban education. I felt like these readings were really interesting for me in particular because I lived through all of these policies being implemented or watched these trends actively happening, whereas in the earlier modules, it was things that, I had heard about in history classes. So this was very real for me. And there are two aspects of this that I really want to touch on. The first and shorter one is just how it affects me personally, and and the second part is the political reflections I might have. So personally, the article entitled "Experiences That Predict Early Career Teacher Commitment to and Retention in High Poverty Urban Schools" by Whip and Geronime hit me pretty hard uh, because I'm a student teacher in an urban school, so I'm not the teacher of record, and I've only been there a semester, teaching in general. But it has been a very enlightening experience, and I'm learning constantly from the students. But with that, I could see how there's teacher burnout. So there were three quotes in particular that I found really fascinating, and I wanted to share and discuss a little bit. So on page 800, it said, other studies indicate that new teachers who begin their careers in high poverty urban schools are more likely to transfer to a different school or district or discontinue teaching altogether within their first 3 years of teaching. I could see that. Totally. And I hear people talking about it constantly, whether it be professors, my peers, other teachers around me, of the burnout being in an urban area, because I think it's especially hard if you don't understand it. I don't come from an urban area, so I think it's harder for me to understand how they can deal with these problems fairly easily. Don't get me wrong, they have plenty of issues with their problems that they encounter, but they let a lot of them slide off their backs. So it's frustrating for me to see them just deal with these issues all day long when I want to go fight for them and I want to go yell about something, but they know that they can't yell about every problem that they encounter. So that's the first quote. The second quote is, and this one hit me very hard, generally these studies have shown high turnover, particularly in urban schools, of young, unmarried females with no dependents. And that was on page 802. That one hit me really hard because I am a young, unmarried female with no dependents. So I could see how the turnover is so key there, because there is an element that someone like me has fairly good mobility, I feel like, in the ability to move around wherever we wanted. But also, as some of those things change, as I age a little bit, as I might become married, I might have dependents in the future, and I could see how one of those things coming into my life, just as with many of those other women, those could easily derail me and make me want to be like, I think I'm done teaching in an urban school for a little bit or ever again. But it also has encouraged me to not become a statistic, and also to take refuge in the fact that there are plenty of other young unmarried females who are going through similar issues as me, who are teachers in urban schools, and that we should congregate together and talk about our struggles so that we can be more prepared and so that we can be mentally more okay. And so the third quote on page 803 said that cross-cultural friendships, unpaid volunteer work in community organizations, and employment in multiracial settings before and adjacent to teacher preparation have been linked to the multiracial awareness and sensitivity that is presumably needed by teachers who commit to and continue teaching in urban schools. That makes a lot of sense just anyway, but I think it's really powerful to see in writing. So my program here at SMU, we are all required to go volunteer in a community center near our urban schools that we are student teaching in. And it's been so helpful to be immersed in the community and the culture, and it gets me just a little bit closer every day to understanding what is going on in these kids' lives, what's going on in their minds, because I've never been an immigrant. I've never had to deal with poverty on some of the levels that they have. And so just talking with them and spending time with them has been so helpful and made it easier to be a student teacher at their neighborhood school. And also just cross-cultural friendships as well at SMU. That's can be kind of difficult because of some inherent, you know, imbalances. But coming from a military community, my dad's in the military, so I was constantly surrounded by other kids who had similar backgrounds in that way, but their families come from all over the country, all over the world, and that is one thing that I will always take with me is I've learned so much from my friends growing up that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I think the idea that cross-cultural friendships could prepare you to deal with students from other cultures, that makes a lot of sense. So I found that those three quotes in particular very powerful and impactful for me so that I can keep those in mind moving forward throughout my teaching career. Okay, so on the political end, on the other end, I want to talk about each of the three presidents briefly, and spending the most time on President Bush with No Child Left Behind. I was born in the late 90s, so No Child Left Behind hit me right as I was entering schools as a kid, so I lived through all of this, and so now it's super fascinating to learn about the history and like what actually happened more than just, oh, I like remember this happening as a child. So I think at its core, I love No Child Left Behind because President Bush saw the gaps. Even after the goals were set by the Nation at Risk report, he saw those gaps and he wanted to fix them. He was troubled by the attitudes of educational leadership across the country, of simply passing kids along because they just can't do it. He wanted us to try as educators. And that's not disparaging the educators that were trying hard, but make it more of a common culture just across the board, just to have everybody invested in every child. And so one quote that stuck out to me from one of the NPR articles, and this woman, she was the state school superintendent in Hawaii. Her name was Catherine Matayoshi, and she said that No Child Left Behind worked very, very hard, was often misunderstood, wanted to do the right thing, but in the end really didn't get where he wanted to go. So unfortunately, it was just too optimistic and really just too unrealistic to be ultimately very successful in reaching those 100% goals. But it was a major stepping stone that allowed the future president or presidents, but particularly Obama, to build off of that. And the education system made huge strides. And so there were plenty of issues that Obama sought to fix and did ultimately fix in a lot of ways. But there's issues that he also had. But anyway, so continuing on with No Child Left Behind, the article titled Urban School Principals and the No Child Left Behind Act, I thought was super fascinating because it examined a couple principals from an urban area in Idaho, and it talked to those principals about what was happening now that No Child Left Behind had been enacted. And so really what they found was these principals recognized that there was a culture of poverty, and they cited that as the reason behind low achieving students, which is not necessarily incorrect, but just a very telling statement. Some principals recognized this and tried to move beyond it by trying to change the school culture, but none of them saw systemic issues that were to blame, especially the common occurrence of white flight, which impacted communities, housing, funding. And so in that same study, principals stated a need to buckle down and teach reading, placing that as a higher priority over other activities. So you can definitely see the emphasis on testing and achievement that principals were now trying to reach with No Child Left Behind, whereas before they've had more activities trying to make it more engaging, and now they're trying to get reading above all else, which is not necessarily wrong. I think it's a pretty good idea to make sure that all children are adequately literate, but it's taking away from some of the enjoyment of school, some of the just education in general that these students should be prepared to have. So, moving on from that, during Obama's terms, we see a transition, also in a positive direction, but there were many faults along the way. There was one thing that I really loved in particular from his campaign that I didn't know about beforehand, was the idea of universal preschool and paying for it with a 94-cent tax increase on cigarettes. But it was said to be beaten down because of lack of support from both sides of the aisle. But I love the idea of it because universal preschool, I think, is a good idea, since all students should have some solid foundations so that they can ultimately be successful going to kindergarten and into the rest of their school career. And I love the idea of using a tax increase on cigarettes, but ultimately that didn't work. But he did have Every Student Succeeds Act passed, and that had bipartisan support, which, considering the times and his presidency, having something passed just automatically, not automatically, but with huge amounts of support, it sounds great. Because he had some struggles along the way. And I think it also, since it had so much support, lends the idea to the idea that No Child Left Behind had plenty of flaws and really needed a major update and a significant update. Once again, great building block, but needed some help and boosting to make it better. And then, last but not least, President Trump. And so it's kind of hard to see, just as there were the articles that we read, more talk about his campaign and the early stuff that has happened. But since his presidency is still going, and we don't know the long-term effects yet, but some things that were troubling to me was his statement in I think 2015. And he just said that he might want to cut the Department of Education altogether, which takes away a lot of the oversight that is necessary to making sure that all students across the country are being treated fairly, getting everything that they need. And also, what was a little troubling was his hatred of Common Core, because it has plenty of implications as a teacher that I'm learning slowly. But as a student who moved around a lot, Common Core kind of unified the country so that if I move somewhere, I could expect to get a similar level of education or follow along similar standards. So those are my thoughts on the politics of it all. So I think knowing all of this is great and important to keep in mind that this is the recent history and I should continue educating myself, especially when I become the teacher of record soon, that I should keep all of these laws and trends in mind so I can be prepared and know what has already happened and what could happen different or again. And I also think it's great to teach when we, enter the last few units of history and talk about, presidents over the last 20, 30 years. That this is something actually relatable to my students and myself, that we have both lived through some elements of this, and I have stories, and I'm assuming they could easily point out some things in their school right now that relate to policies that we've read about. And so I think it's also good for them to know the urban implications of some of these policies and how it affects them directly, and how it might not affect somebody from a suburban, mostly white community, but how it changes their lives more than